The Missouri River churned dark and restless beneath a heavy autumn sky as Margaret Anderson stood at her bedroom window, watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the bluffs. 3 years had passed since her husband Frank's body was found floating face down in those murky waters, but the pain remained as sharp as ever. Her isolated trading post, perched on a lonely stretch between Dodge City and civilization, had become both sanctuary and prison. The creaking floorboards beneath her feet concealed secrets that would hang her if discovered. Margaret absently touched the gold locket at her throat, the last gift Frank had given her before everything changed. Inside was a carefully folded document that proved what she had long suspected about the corrupt lawmen who controlled the river trade. The same men who had murdered Frank when he threatened to expose their operation. A cold wind rattled the shutters as Margaret lit the oil lamps, casting wavering shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The trading post had been quiet lately, with fewer boats stopping as winter approached. She preferred it that way now. Easier to keep her secrets when she didn't have to look honest men in the eye. The three who had tried forcing the truth from her these past months lay silent beneath the floorboards, their bodies preserved by the cellar's chill. The sharp rap of knuckles on the front door made her jump, heart racing. Through the wavy glass, she could make out a tall figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. A stranger, by his outline, not one of the river patrolmen who still watched her movements. Margaret's hand strayed to the loaded Colt in her apron pocket as she cracked open the door. "Evening, ma'am," the man said softly, removing his hat. "Name's Daniel Clark. My horse went lame about 3 miles back. I was hoping I might impose on your hospitality until morning." His clothes were trail-worn but decent, his manner polite. But Margaret had learned the hard way that appearances meant little along the river. Still, turning him away would draw more attention than letting him stay. "Come in, Mr. Clark," she said, stepping aside. "I can offer you supper and a bed in the storeroom, but I should warn you, I've had trouble with thieves lately. I keep a loaded gun close and I know how to use it." The implied threat came easily now, practiced over countless similar encounters. Daniel Clark merely nodded, a ghost of a smile playing at his lips. As Margaret prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, she studied her guest covertly. He moved with the easy grace of a man accustomed to hard work, but his hands were too smooth for a common laborer. His speech was educated, at odds with his rough attire. Most tellingly, he asked no questions about her situation, unusual for travelers encountering a woman alone at a remote trading post. Over supper, Clark spoke of inconsequential things: the weather, the condition of the river road, news from Dodge City. But his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail of the room. Margaret had seen that calculating look before, on the faces of men who came seeking answers about Frank's death. Men who now lay cold and still in her cellar, their questions forever silenced. When the dishes were cleared, Margaret showed Clark to the storeroom. "The nights get cold this time of year," she said, "but I'm afraid I can't offer you any extra blankets. The river trade's been slow lately." A deliberate lie. The shelves behind them were stacked with wool blankets waiting for the winter riverboat traffic. Let him wonder about that inconsistency. Let him lie awake questioning her story. As Margaret climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she paused on the landing. "One more thing, Mr. Clark," she called softly. "If you should feel the need to explore during the night, if curiosity gets the better of you, remember my warning about thieves. A woman alone can't be too careful about protecting what's hers." In the shadowy storeroom below, Daniel Clark's silence spoke volumes. In her bedroom, Margaret sat at her vanity, methodically brushing her dark hair while watching the moon cast silver ribbons across the floorboards. Those same boards that creaked with secrets below, holding the remains of men who'd asked too many questions about Frank. Her late husband's badge still gleamed on her dresser, a constant reminder of the corruption that had taken root in the Cheyenne Marshal's office long before Frank's death. The brush paused mid-stroke as Margaret caught movement in her mirror, a shadow passing beneath her door. Clark was testing the boundaries, just as she'd expected. The floorboards whispered his careful footsteps as he crept down the hallway. She smiled thinly, knowing the storeroom ruse would prove too tempting. Men like him always thought themselves cleverer than a widow living alone. Through her window, Margaret watched the river rolling past, its dark waters holding memories of the night Frank had discovered Henry's smuggling operation. The marshal and his deputies had been using the river trade to move more than just legitimate goods. When Frank threatened to expose them, his accidental drowning was swift and brutal, but they hadn't counted on his widow's determination to uncover the truth. The first man who'd come asking questions was Charlie, a deputy from Deadwood. He'd been persistent, claiming to be investigating corruption along the river routes. But Margaret had seen him slip a letter to Henry at the docks, and that night, Charlie joined Frank beneath the floorboards. Robert and Susan from El Paso had followed, their questions about missing shipments ending just as abruptly. Now, Daniel Clark's footsteps had grown silent, but Margaret knew he hadn't returned to the storeroom. She reached beneath her pillow, fingers wrapping around the familiar grip of Frank's revolver. The weapon had served her well these past months, though she preferred the quiet efficiency of the laudanum she kept hidden in her sewing box. Less mess, fewer questions. Rising silently, Margaret moved to her door. She could hear Clark in Frank's old study, rifling through papers. The sound of drawers opening and closing carried clearly in the still house. Whatever Henry and his corrupt lawmen were looking for, they wouldn't find it here. The ledger documenting their crimes was safely hidden, where no one would think to look, sealed inside one of the trade crates bound for Dodge City tomorrow morning. Margaret's bare feet made no sound as she descended the stairs, revolver ready. Clark had been careless, leaving a lamp burning in the study. Its glow spilled into the hallway, illuminating the silver badge on his vest, identical to the one that had been pinned to Frank's chest the day they pulled him from the river. Another of Henry's men, then. They were getting desperate if they'd sent someone so obvious. The house creaked and settled around them, its old bones holding steady despite the weight of its secrets. Tomorrow, Margaret would send the ledger downriver, entrusted to Martha, the only person she still had faith in. Let Henry and his corrupt band of lawmen chase shadows while the evidence of their crimes floated away. But tonight, she had more immediate concerns. She paused outside the study door, watching Clark's shadow move across the wall. He was so focused on searching the desk that he didn't hear her approach. Margaret allowed herself a small, grim smile. Soon, the cellar would hold another man who'd underestimated a widow's resolve. The floorboards would groan with one more secret, and the river would roll on, indifferent to the justice dealt in the dark hours before dawn. Her finger tightened on the trigger as she stepped into the doorway. "Found what you're looking for, mister?" "Clark?" Margaret's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of steel. "Or should I call you Deputy Clark?" Henry must be truly desperate to send one of his own so soon after Robert's disappearance. Clark slowly raised his hands, turning to face Margaret with calculated precision. The lamplight caught the silver badge partially concealed beneath his coat, a badge that now seemed more a mark of shame than authority. "Mrs. Thompson," he said evenly, "you're making a grave mistake. The ledger belongs to the Territory Marshal's office." His eyes darted to the window, where the river's constant murmur provided a deceptive sense of normalcy to their deadly standoff. Margaret kept the rifle steady, her years of hunting with Robert serving her well in this moment. The only mistake was Henry thinking he could send another corrupt deputy to clean up his mess. "Robert trusted you, Clark. He considered you a friend before he discovered what you and Henry were doing with those riverboat manifests." The bitterness in her voice could have curdled milk. Outside, a storm was brewing over the river valley, the air growing thick with the promise of rain. Lightning flickered in the distance, briefly illuminating the study through its large windows Robert had insisted on installing so he could watch the boats pass while he worked. The memory made Margaret's throat tighten, but she forced it away. Sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford, not with Clark's hand inching toward his holster. "Your husband was a fool, Margaret. He should have taken the money like everyone else. The river trade's been good to those smart enough to look the other way." Clark's voice held no remorse, only a cold practicality that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Henry's offering you the same deal. A generous monthly stipend to forget what you think you know." The first fat drops of rain began to strike the window panes as Margaret took a step forward. Robert wasn't the fool. He was the only honest man left in this cesspool you call law enforcement. Did Henry tell you how many bodies are buried along this river? How many honest merchants disappeared after refusing to pay your protection fees? She could see the calculation in Clark's eyes, the desperate math of a man wondering if he could draw before she pulled the trigger. Thunder rolled across the valley as Clark's expression hardened. "You've got no proof of anything, just the ravings of a grieving widow. Even if you had Robert's ledger, who would believe you over the word of respected lawmen?" His confidence wavered slightly as Margaret's lips curved into a knowing smile. The midnight wind whistled through cracks in Margaret Clark's farmhouse, making the oil lamp flicker ominously. Her visitor, Henry Anderson, sat quietly at her rough-hewn table, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Outside, the Missouri River's dark waters churned past her isolated homestead, carrying secrets as deep as her own. She watched him carefully, noting how his eyes kept drifting to the uneven floorboards near the pantry. Henry shifted in his chair, his trail-worn clothes still damp from fording the river earlier that day. "Ma'am, I appreciate your hospitality," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the wind. "But I can't help wondering why a woman like yourself would choose to live so far from civilization." His words carried an edge of suspicion that made Margaret's fingers tighten around her own cup. The truth about her husband Robert's death lay buried beneath those very floorboards, along with Marshal Frank Taylor and two of his deputies. They'd discovered her running supplies to Confederate holdouts, still fighting months after Appomattox. The marshal's greed had led him to blackmail rather than arrest her. When Robert found out and confronted them, they'd shot him in cold blood. "The river trade keeps me comfortable enough," Margaret replied carefully, watching Henry's reaction. She knew he wasn't just a simple traveler. His calloused trigger finger and the way he positioned himself with his back to the wall spoke of law enforcement training. The question was whether he was here by chance or if someone in Dodge City had finally started asking questions about the missing marshal. A sudden pounding at the door made them both jump. Through the window, Margaret glimpsed the silhouette of Charlie Moore, the corrupt Port Authority official who'd been taking his cut of her smuggling operation since before Robert's death. His presence now, with a stranger in her house, could unravel everything she'd sacrificed to protect. "Best you stay quiet," Margaret whispered to Henry, her hand sliding beneath her apron to grip the derringer hidden there. River folk can be dangerous after dark. The irony of her warning wasn't lost on her as she moved to answer the door, her skirts brushing across the boards that concealed her gruesome secret. Charlie burst in with unusual urgency, then froze at the sight of Henry. "Margaret, we've got trouble coming downriver," he stammered, clearly thrown off by the stranger's presence. "A federal marshal's office has been asking questions in Cheyenne about missing lawmen." His eyes darted nervously between them, and Margaret could see him wondering if he'd just made a fatal mistake. Henry's hand had moved to rest near his holster, his earlier pretense of simple weariness falling away. "Interesting timing," he said, rising slowly. "I was just about to ask Mrs. Clark here about her late husband's connection to Marshal Taylor's disappearance." The tension in the room crackled like summer lightning over the prairie. Margaret's mind raced through her options. Charlie was a coward who would talk if pressured. Henry was clearly more than he seemed. And somewhere upstream, more lawmen were closing in. She couldn't let them find the bodies, not just to save herself, but to protect the network of Confederate survivors who depended on her supply line. "You boys want to know the truth about Frank Taylor?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "Then let me tell you about corruption that goes all the way to the territorial governor's office." But first, she moved to retrieve a bottle of whiskey from the shelf, carefully positioning herself between them and the trapdoor that held her darkest secrets. The next hours unfolded like a deadly chess match as Margaret wove truth with lies, playing the two men against each other. She revealed enough about Taylor's extortion scheme to make her story credible while keeping her deeper involvement hidden. All the while, she watched for any sign that either man suspected the full extent of her deception. As Margaret poured the whiskey, a floorboard creaked beneath Henry's boot, too close to the hidden trapdoor. She steadied her hand, watching as amber liquid caught the lamplight. Through the window, she glimpsed movement in the tree line, probably Charlie's men taking positions around the house. The walls were closing in, but she'd survived worse odds during the war. Taylor was running protection rackets up and down the Missouri, she continued, noting how Henry's eyes narrowed at the mention of the river trade. Forcing merchants to pay double taxes, one for the territory and one for his private coffers. Those who refused found their cargo mysteriously lost to river pirates who never seemed to target the paying businesses. The whiskey was doing its work on Charlie, his weather-beaten face growing flushed. But Henry remained stone sober, his calculating gaze taking in every detail of the room. He'd noticed the fresh saw marks on the floorboards. Margaret was certain of it. She needed to draw his attention elsewhere before he put the pieces together. "The real trouble started when Daniel Harris from Deadwood refused to pay," Margaret said, weaving in names and places she knew would catch their interest. "Taylor sent men to burn his warehouse. 3 people died in that fire, including Daniel's young daughter. The truth of that particular tragedy lent weight to her broader deception. A sudden gust rattled the windows, making Charlie jump. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the river, nature conspiring to trap them all in this deadly game of cat and mouse. Margaret used the moment to shift position, keeping herself between the lawman and her secrets while maintaining an air of casual hospitality. "What I don't understand," Henry said slowly, "is how a widow running a remote trading post knows so much about Taylor's operation." His tone was neutral, but there was steel beneath it. "Unless you were more than just an observer." He set his untouched whiskey aside and stood, his hand casually near his holster. Thunder rolled across the river as Margaret calculated her options. The storm would make the crossing treacherous, cutting off Charlie's reinforcements. But it also meant anyone who died tonight could be easily swept downstream, their secrets carried away by the muddy Missouri's swift current. "I was Taylor's bookkeeper," she admitted, the partial truth flowing smooth as honey. "He trusted me because I was a widow, thought I was desperate enough to stay quiet. Never realized I was keeping records of every transaction, every name, every crime." She moved to her desk, making a show of reaching for documents while positioning herself near the hidden derringer in the drawer. Charlie leaned forward eagerly, but Henry's expression remained unchanged. "And where are these records now?" he asked, his boot scraping another floorboard. This one didn't creak. It was one of the few sections Margaret hadn't had to replace after burying Taylor and his men. "Safe," she replied, matching his steady gaze. "Insurance, you might say, distributed among trusted friends from Cheyenne to El Paso." The lie was calculated to make them hesitate, to make them wonder how far the conspiracy might reach. "Kill me, and those records go straight to the territorial governor's political rivals." The storm broke in earnest now, rain hammering the roof as lightning split the sky. In that brilliant flash, Margaret caught the slight widening of Henry's eyes. Not fear, but recognition. He knew her from somewhere, from before. And in that moment, she realized the game had shifted. This was no longer about protecting just her secrets, but unraveling his as well. Charlie was oblivious to the silent exchange, already 3 sheets to the wind and rambling about river pirates. But Henry had gone completely still, like a predator scenting larger prey. The question was, would he reveal what he knew, or would he play along until he could strike from the shadows? Margaret felt the familiar ice in her veins, the same cold clarity that had served her during the war. She'd survived by reading men's intentions, by staying 3 moves ahead in a game where the stakes were life and death. Tonight would be no different. The storm raged on, trapping them all in this deadly dance of secrets and lies. The grandfather clock in the corner struck midnight, its chime nearly lost in the thunderous downpour. Margaret moved to stoke the fire, using the moment to study Henry's reflection in the tarnished mirror above the mantel. His weathered face remained impassive, but his fingers traced unconscious patterns on the arm of his chair, the same nervous habit she remembered from the courthouse in Dodge City 3 years ago. He'd been wearing a marshal's badge then, standing beside Judge Robert while they sentenced an innocent man to hang. Charlie's drunken snoring provided a steady backdrop as Margaret poured more coffee, her hands steady despite the tempest in her mind. The river trade had taught her patience, how to navigate treacherous waters both literal and figurative. She'd learned that the most dangerous currents often lay beneath a placid surface, like the letters hidden in her bedroom, documenting years of bribes paid to lawmen who turned blind eyes to the bodies that occasionally surfaced downstream. "Strange weather for this time of year," Henry remarked casually, accepting the steaming cup. "Reminds me of a night in Cheyenne, back when I worked with Marshal Daniel." His emphasis on the name was subtle but deliberate. Daniel, her late husband's partner in the shipping business, before both men had mysteriously vanished. Margaret's pulse quickened, but her face revealed nothing as she settled into the chair opposite him. The wind howled through gaps in the window frames, carrying with it the damp, earthy smell of the river. Below their feet, beneath layers of timber and soil, lay the truth about what happened to Daniel, Frank, and poor young Robert. Each man had threatened to expose the web of corruption that stretched from the docks of El Paso to the gambling dens of Deadwood. Each had discovered too late that some secrets were worth killing for. "I heard Daniel was headed to Deadwood," Margaret said carefully, testing the waters. Strange that he never arrived. The midnight hour crept closer as Laura Anderson sat rigid in her parlor chair, watching the stranger who called himself Henry Clark tend to the crackling fire. His weathered hands moved with practiced ease, stoking the flames higher against the bitter autumn chill. Outside, the Missouri River's distant rushing provided an ominous backdrop to their tense silence. She'd let him in 3 hours ago when he'd appeared on her doorstep, claiming his horse had gone lame a mile back. Through the window, Laura could see the first snowflakes beginning to fall, dancing eerily in the moonlight. Her hand instinctively moved to touch the locket at her throat, the last gift from her husband Daniel before his accident 6 months ago. The same accident that had claimed the lives of Frank Moore and Robert Walker, two deputies who'd been investigating corruption at the El Paso Customs House where Daniel had worked. Henry turned from the fireplace, his sharp eyes catching the nervous movement of her fingers. "That's a mighty fine piece of jewelry, Mrs. Anderson," he said softly. "Reminds me of one I saw recently in Dodge City. Man there was trying to fence it, claimed it belonged to a dead customs agent." Laura's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the deliberate trap in his words. The floorboards beneath her feet seemed to grow warm with their terrible secret. 3 bodies, 3 men who'd discovered the truth about the river smuggling operation. Daniel had been ready to expose it all, to reveal how Marshal Charlie Taylor was using his position to run contraband up and down the Missouri. But Charlie had gotten to him first, or so Laura had thought until that fatal night when Daniel himself had tried to silence her. "I know what really happened here," Henry said, rising slowly to his full height. "I've been tracking this case for months, following the bodies, the missing evidence, the corrupted lawmen. I'm not just some wandering cowboy, Mrs. Anderson. I'm a Pinkerton agent." His hand moved toward his coat, but Laura was faster, the derringer already steady in her grip. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice steel-edged. "I've killed to protect this secret before, and I'll do it again if I have to. You don't understand what's really happening here." The weapon didn't waver as she slowly stood, keeping Henry fixed in her sights. Daniel wasn't just another victim. He was the mastermind. Those deputies weren't investigating corruption. They were part of it. Henry's eyes widened as Laura continued. "I found Daniel's ledger the night he died, when he tried to kill me. The customs house, the smuggling, the murders. It was all him and Marshal Taylor working together. Daniel killed those deputies when they tried to blackmail him for a bigger cut. Then he came for me when he realized I'd discovered everything. But Marshal Taylor is still out there," Henry said quietly. "Still running the operation. Still killing to keep it quiet. Just last week, a witness named Martha Clark was found dead in Cheyenne. That's what brought me here, following the trail of bodies that leads straight back to El Paso." Laura's hand trembled slightly at the news, remembering Martha's kind face from church socials. "I had no choice that night," Laura whispered, the memories flooding back. "Daniel was drunk, raving about loose ends and liabilities. He came at me with a knife. I grabbed his gun from the dresser. The deputies, they came looking for him later, but they were just as corrupt. Each time it was kill or be killed. I buried them under the floorboards because I knew no one would believe the truth." The clock struck midnight as Henry slowly raised his hands. "I believe you, Mrs. Anderson. I've seen enough evidence to know you're telling the truth, but we can't let Taylor keep killing. Help me bring him down. Help me end this." Laura studied his face in the firelight, searching for any sign of deception. Finally, she lowered the derringer. "There's something else you should see," she said, moving to a hidden panel in the wall. From behind it, she withdrew a stack of papers, Daniel's detailed records of the smuggling operation, dates, names, shipments, bribes paid. "This is what they were willing to kill for. This is what will bring them all down." Henry took the papers with careful hands, his eyes widening as he scanned the damning evidence. The snowfall grew heavier outside as they formed their plan. Laura would play the grieving widow one last time, draw Taylor in with hints about Daniel's missing ledger. Henry would be waiting with a team of Pinkerton agents ready to end the corruption that had claimed so many lives. As they talked, Laura felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, the terrible burden of secrets kept too long in darkness. Dawn was breaking over the river when Henry finally left, the precious documents secured inside his coat. Laura watched him ride away, knowing that soon, Marshal Taylor would face justice for all the lives he'd destroyed. She touched the locket one last time before removing it and dropping it into the fire. The past could stay buried under her floorboards. She had a future to build, one that didn't require any more killing to protect. The morning brought no peace to Laura's restless mind. Though Henry had left with the evidence, she knew Marshal Taylor would soon discover his precious ledger was missing. The trading post along the river had grown quiet, most merchants having fled upriver to escape the growing tension. Only the crunch of snow and occasional cry of wheeling hawks broke the eerie silence. Laura methodically prepared the house, knowing Taylor would come. She moved furniture away from the walls, cleared paths to the doors, and loaded the rifle Daniel had taught her to shoot. The weight of it felt familiar now, like the weight of all her choices. Through the window, she watched smoke rise from chimneys in the distance, where unknowing families went about their daily lives in Dodge City. By midday, hoofbeats approached from the south. Not the steady rhythm of Henry's return with the Pinkertons, but the erratic pace of multiple riders pushing their horses hard. Laura's hand steadied on the rifle as Marshal Taylor and two deputies emerged from the tree line, their horses' flanks dark with sweat despite the cold. Taylor dismounted first, his badge gleaming dully in the winter light. His practiced smile didn't reach his eyes as he approached the porch. "Mrs. Wheeler," he called out, using Daniel's surname. "Seems we have a problem needs discussing." His deputies spread out, moving to flank the house. Laura noticed they kept their hands close to their holsters. "I've been expecting you, Marshal," Laura replied, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. She didn't move from her position just inside the doorway. "Though I'd have thought you'd come alone, given the sensitive nature of what's missing." The implied threat made Taylor's smile falter for just a moment. Inside, Laura could feel the floorboards creaking beneath her feet, boards that concealed not just bodies but years of carefully gathered evidence. Daniel hadn't died simply for discovering Taylor's corruption. He'd died because he'd documented every detail, every name, every transaction that proved how deep the rot went in the marshal's office. Taylor took another step forward, soy crunching under his boots. "Now, Laura, let's be reasonable. Whatever Daniel told you, whatever papers you think you have, they don't tell the whole story. I can make this right." His voice dropped lower, meant for her ears alone. "There's still a place for you in all this." Daniel made his choice. "You don't have to make the same mistake." A bitter laugh escaped Laura's lips. "Is that what you told Frank and Charlie too? Before you added them to the collection under my floor?" She saw Taylor's hand twitch toward his gun and knew she'd struck home. "They trusted you, same as Daniel did. Trusted you right up until they realized what you really were." The marshal's facade cracked, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Those men died resisting arrest. Official record's quite clear on that." His eyes narrowed. "Just like it'll show how the grieving widow finally broke, burned down her house with herself inside. Tragic story, really." But Laura had already spotted movement in the trees behind Taylor, riders approaching silently through the snow. Henry had brought the Pinkertons right on schedule. She allowed herself a small smile, watching confusion spread across Taylor's face as he realized she wasn't afraid. "You're right about one thing, Marshal," Laura said, stepping fully into the doorway. "The official record will tell quite a story. Just not the one you're planning to write." As if on cue, Henry's voice rang out across the yard, ordering Taylor and his deputies to drop their weapons. The marshal's hand had barely touched his gun when the first shots exploded through the winter air. As the agents secured the scene, Henry approached Laura with a grim satisfaction. "It's done," he said simply. "The evidence is already on its way to the federal marshal in Cheyenne. Taylor's whole network will come crashing down." He paused, studying her face. "What will you do now?" Laura looked back at the house, at the floorboards that held so many secrets. "Bury the dead properly this time," she said softly. "Then burn it all down and start fresh somewhere else. Maybe up near Deadwood. I hear they're building something new there." The sun was setting as the Pinkertons began their work, digging through the frozen ground to recover the bodies that would complete their case. Laura watched from the porch, finally feeling free to mourn Daniel properly. The river flowed on beneath its coat of ice, carrying away the last echoes of gunfire and the weight of all those years of silence. Margaret Anderson's eyes narrowed as Sheriff Daniel Clark read from the yellowed pages of her late husband's journal. The truth had finally emerged in the candlelit parlor of her riverside trading post, where 3 bodies lay beneath creaking floorboards stained with decades of secrets. The wandering cowboy, who'd revealed himself as a U.S. Marshal, wasn't after her at all. He'd been tracking a conspiracy that stretched from El Paso to the muddy banks of the Missouri. "Your husband discovered something that got him killed, Mrs. Anderson," Daniel said softly, turning another brittle page. "The shipping manifests he kept. They prove the former sheriff was running an empire of corruption. Frank Moore wasn't just taking bribes from river traders, He was eliminating anyone who threatened to expose him. Margaret's hands trembled as she poured more whiskey. The three dead men beneath her feet had been Moore's deputies, sent one by one over the past year to silence her. Each had discovered too late that she was ready for them. Henry knew the truth would get him killed, she whispered. That's why he left me everything in writing, the evidence, the names, the bloody trail leading straight to Moore's door. The rainstorm intensified outside, drumming against the trading post's tin roof. Daniel studied Margaret's face in the flickering light. Those men under the floorboards, Moore's thugs came to kill you, didn't they? But you were ready. Henry taught you how to defend yourself before they got to him. It wasn't really a question. Margaret simply nodded, remembering the weight of the shotgun in her hands, the look of surprise on each deputy's face. Frank Moore's reach extended far beyond this river, Daniel continued. We've been building a case against him for years. Your husband's records are the final piece we needed. But Moore still has allies in every town from here to Deadwood. Getting you safely to testify won't be easy. Lightning flashed across the swollen river visible through the window, illuminating the muddy banks where so many secrets lay buried. Margaret moved to the heavy oak cabinet in the corner, unlocking it with a key she kept on a chain around her neck. Inside lay more of Henry's journals, along with letters, bank records, and a small leather pouch. There's more than just papers, she said. Henry kept samples of the stolen goods, gems, gold dust, things Moore's men took from honest traders, physical proof of the thefts. A pounding at the door made them both freeze. Through the rain-streaked glass, Margaret glimpsed the shapes of riders in the yard. Daniel drew his revolver, positioning himself in the shadows. Moore must have informants watching the trading posts, he muttered. We need to move. Now. But Margaret was already heading for the concealed cellar door, where she'd prepared for this moment since Henry's death. The hidden room below held supplies, weapons, and a tunnel that led to a small dock on the river. Henry had built it years ago, suspecting this day would come. As booted feet splintered the front door above, Daniel followed Margaret into the darkness. She sealed the trapdoor just as Moore's men burst in, their lanterns casting wild shadows across the blood-stained floorboards that held their dead companions. They emerged on the riverbank where a small skiff was moored in the shadows of overhanging willows. The rain provided cover as they loaded Henry's evidence and pushed off into the current. Margaret looked back at the trading post one last time, remembering the life she'd built there with Henry. But she knew the truth in his journals would destroy Moore's corrupt empire if they could reach Cheyenne alive to testify. Dawn found them miles downstream, cold and wet, but alive. Daniel had contacts in Cheyenne, honest lawmen who'd help protect Margaret until the trial. As the sun rose over the river, Margaret finally allowed herself to feel something beyond survival. Justice for Henry was within reach. The dead men beneath her floorboards had been the price of staying alive long enough to see it done. Moore won't stop hunting us, Daniel warned as they approached a small settlement. His influence runs deep in these territories. But we have surprise on our side. He won't expect you to have Henry's evidence, or to have survived this long. Margaret touched the journals in their oilskin wrapping. 3 dead deputies had learned too late that she was more than just a widow. Soon their master would learn the same lesson. The trial in Cheyenne lasted 2 weeks. Margaret's testimony, backed by Henry's meticulous records, unraveled Moore's criminal empire piece by piece. The evidence implicated corrupt officials across 3 territories. When the verdicts were read, Margaret sat straight-backed in the courthouse, meeting Moore's hateful stare without flinching. The man who'd ordered her husband's death would hang at dawn. Years later, Margaret still ran the trading post, though she'd moved it upstream to safer waters. Daniel visited sometimes, bringing news of continuing investigations into corruption along the river trade routes. The lessons of Henry's death had made the territories safer for honest merchants. And if anyone asked about the old trading post's blood-stained floors, Margaret would simply smile and pour another drink. Some secrets, she'd learned, were best kept buried. The years rolled by like the river's steady flow, but Margaret never forgot the lessons written in blood across her trading post's floors. She'd built something new from those dark foundations, a thriving business that served as a beacon of honest commerce along the water routes. The old storage cellar where she'd once hidden evidence against Moore had been sealed up tight, though sometimes on quiet nights she could still hear phantom echoes of desperate men's final breaths. Daniel had married Rachel, the schoolteacher from Cheyenne, and they'd built a home just upriver from Margaret's new establishment. Their children played along the shoreline while their parents kept watch for the occasional river pirate or desperate drifter. The territory had grown safer since Moore's hanging, but old habits of vigilance died hard. Margaret had taught them well that survival meant staying alert, even in times of peace. On the 10th anniversary of Henry's death, Margaret hosted a quiet gathering at the trading post. Daniel and Rachel came, along with Martha from the telegraph office and a few other trusted friends who knew pieces of the true story. They raised glasses to Henry's memory and to justice served, though none spoke directly of the blood price that justice had demanded. Some wounds, Margaret had learned, healed better in silence. The river trade routes had changed too, growing more organized as the territories pushed toward statehood. Regular steamboat service now connected the settlements, making the isolated trading posts of the past unnecessary. Margaret adapted, transforming her business into a proper mercantile that served both river traffic and the growing farming communities. The old ways were fading, but she made sure certain stories endured. She kept Henry's ledgers locked in her office, their pages still bearing witness to the corruption they'd helped expose. Sometimes new lawmen would visit, studying the careful columns of numbers and notes that had brought down Moore's empire. Margaret would watch them trace the same patterns Henry had found, seeing in their eyes the same righteous anger that had driven her own quest for justice. Daniel's oldest boy showed a keen interest in the river trade, reminding Margaret of Henry in his younger days. She began teaching the lad the intricacies of commerce and the importance of keeping detailed records. But she also taught him to watch for the signs of corruption that had cost his uncle's life. The too generous offer, the whispered threat, the midnight visitor with blood on his hands. The territory had grown more civilized, but human nature hadn't changed. Every season brought new schemes and schemers trying to control the river trade. Margaret's reputation as a shrewd businesswoman who couldn't be bought or bullied helped keep the worst elements at bay. Those who knew her history understood that her steel wasn't just for show. She'd proved more than once that she could still handle a rifle when necessary. One autumn evening, a stranger arrived claiming to represent Eastern investors interested in consolidating the river trade. His smile was practiced, his clothes too fine for the frontier, and his offers of partnership too generous by half. Margaret served him coffee while Daniel's boy watched from behind the counter, learning how to read the signs. The stranger left empty-handed, having learned that some businesses weren't for sale at any price. Later, Margaret showed the boy the hidden compartment where she kept Henry's pistol, cleaned and loaded these many years later. "The river gives life," she told him, echoing words Henry had once spoken. "But it can take life just as easily. Remember that power flows both ways." The boy nodded solemnly, already understanding that his education went beyond mere numbers and ledgers. As she grew older, Margaret began preparing for the day she'd pass the trading post to the next generation. She'd built something that mattered, a legacy of honest commerce and quiet strength. The floorboards of the old post might have held dark secrets, but they'd also provided the foundation for something better. Sometimes justice demanded a heavy price, but Margaret had paid it willingly, turning blood-bought wisdom into a better future for those who followed. The river kept flowing, wearing smooth the rough edges of the past. New settlements sprouted along its banks, and new stories replaced the old. But in quiet moments, Margaret would stand at her window watching the water pass, remembering the night she'd whispered a deadly warning to a stranger and set in motion events that would change the territories forever. She'd learned then that some secrets were worth killing for, and some truths were worth dying to protect.